Well, thank you all for joining. I'm very excited to be up here with this esteemed panel. And if you would allow me, I'm going to set the stage a bit. I think what we've heard over the last couple days is that it's very exciting. It's a very exciting time in the industry and in the world as we think about 5G and where we are. 5G is here and it's off. It's off to a great start. The networks blanket America and are leading the world in 5G availability. The faster speeds and more responsive networks have enabled all kinds of new and innovative use cases. I'll say that a comment made to me earlier today, noted all the cool things and all the videos on the main stage keynotes, and I agree. It always, goosebumps when you see some of these new things. The industry has invested record amount of money and will drive $1.5 trillion into America's economy and create at least 4.5 million new jobs. This kind of investment is to meet this ever-growing demand that I think, for those of you who saw Meredith's keynote yesterday, she noted that by 2027, it's expected that consumers will quintuple their mobile data usage. usage. And to keep up with that, I think estimates that we're seeing is that we'll need kind of 1,500 megahertz of new spectrum. So how do we do this? How is that accomplished? Well, every 4 years, the World Radio Conference reviews and revises the radio regulations, which is the international treaty that governs the use of spectrum. WRC 23 definitely offers an opportunity for stakeholders to collaborate on the development of a cohesive international spectrum strategy that accounts for the needs of providers today, but also looks into the future. And so the outcomes of WRC 23 could have significant implications for America's leadership in the development and deployment of wireless communications and connectivity for all Americans. And so with that, allow me to introduce our panelists. Next to me here is José Arias, the head of government affairs from LATAM of Nokia. John Hunter, the senior director of technology and engineering policy with T-Mobile. Jayne Stancavage, the VP of Policy and Regulatory Affairs with Intel. Hank Hultquist, the VP of Federal Regulatory at AT&T. John Kuzin, the VP of Spectrum Policy and Regulatory Counsel at Qualcomm. And Luiz Zoghbi, Spectrum Engagement Director at GSMA. So to kick things off, I'm hoping that we could do a bit of an overview of the WRC. I will admit I have not been to one of those conferences, so I think it would be helpful. Maybe you, Jayne, can give us kind of what it is and how it relates to kind of achieving your organization's goals.
So basically, well, first, thanks for coming, and it's really nice to see a bunch of friends up here with me. I will say the first time we did the international panel here, Julie Knapp was the only one who was willing to come up, so welcome. Thank you.
It's very exciting, Tom.
So all of you equal one Julie Knapp. I'm just
Not really.
So basically, it's a 4-year process. You do 4 years of studies, and during that, we come up with a position in the U.S. We try to convince our colleagues in the Americas, and then we go into a conference. So we spend 4 years of technical studies. We try to reach consensus on what the options are. And we lock ourselves into a large conference room with 4,000 people who've studied the thing they care about the most for 4 years. And you try to get to agreement over 4 weeks. Very orderly process for most, but never for IMT. So IMT, you always go, I can tell you now, down to the last hour, like when we'll come to agreement, because it's the amount of time you need to translate to get to the final declaration. So the big thing is you get spectrum access and you get the technical conditions. But it's a long, onerous process. And at the end of the 4 weeks, with no sleep, get 2 days off and you start it all over again. So you probably want to join, right?
It sounds delightful. I mean, Geneva, I've heard, is great, but it sounds like you might be in a basement conference room for a long time.
But this one's in Dubai.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah. Thank you for the correction. Luiz, I think you have some experience in this field too. I don't know if you had anything else to add about setting the overview.
Yeah, of course. No, I'll take a different direction just to complement the comment from Jayne. Is that some people tend to say the WRC is kind of a competition camp within different services and the discussions that the WRC brings. But I tend to say that it's a different side of things. It is the idea of every single service having the right amount of spectrum for the benefit of society as a socioeconomic benefit impact for that to actually make sense for those identifications and in some cases allocations to actually happen throughout the WRC. So those 4 years of work, they pay off because it is as the ITU is a UN agency and the decisions are made via treaties as Christiaan also mentioned. I think it's important for us to bear in mind that it's also a very interesting process of how the decision is taken. So I see it more of a peaceful way of discussion and seeing the WRC as a moment of making sure that everybody has the right access to the right amount of spectrum than kind of a competition camp that we hear sometimes people say. But the other aspect of the WRC is how it also relates to the technologies that are coming, right? So we're talking about this time around, we're talking about expansion of 5G via 6 gigahertz, or the affordability of 5G continuing 3.5, as well as low bands for the benefit of people that don't have access to the services the same quality that others do. But if we take a step back for the time where 3G was introduced, and then 2G was introduced in 79, and then 3G is introduced in 92, and then 4G introduced for the first time in 2000, and then 2015 5G, and then 2019 continue that process. And then we are about to see, and I think this is also part of the conversation, the 6G conversation for 2027. So this is just a complement of the comment that was made.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like for someone who hasn't been there, it's some combination of a very strict process, but also maybe trying to wait out your competitors and get something done at the very last minute. Somewhere in between those two things.
No, it takes that long to try to get to agreement on that. It's like 170, 180 countries that have to agree, right? So. Yeah.
Well, compromise can be messy. I think Luiz mentioned a few spectrum bands, and I know that Commissioner Carr mentioned mid-band. So I was going to turn to mid-band because I think it's been a point of interest here this week, and obviously maybe for all of us on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute basis. There has been, I think around the world, we've seen a focus on mid-band to drive sort of that capacity of the kind of innovative use cases of 5G. And so, maybe Hank, I'll turn to you on this one. At a time where the U.S. Seems to be, I think as Commissioner Carr mentioned, at a mid-band deficit compared to some of the other countries like China, I'd love to hear kind of how you see from a mobile provider perspective, the opportunities for additional spectrum at WRC 23, and what bands are maybe your priorities for the conference.
Thanks for that, and thanks for inviting me, Christiaan. I think, when you look at it, what you see is that, if I've done the math right, WRC 23 is going to look at about 1,690 megahertz of spectrum that could be identified for IMT. And, this is ranging from bands from 3.3 to 3.4 up to 10.0 to 10.5, pieces in between. I think from a U.S. perspective, you have to recognize that there's only one of those bands that we have a positive position on, 3.3 to 3.4. And, we've already auctioned 3.7 to 3.8 as part of C-band, and we've also, have the spectrum of 3.6 to 3.7 as part of CBRS. So if you look at what WRC is doing and then you look at sort of U.S. opportunities, it's hard to come away with a warm and fuzzy feeling about how this is going to work out for U.S. carriers. Could that change? Could we see movement? We'll have to wait and see. But I think if you look at the facts right now, and meanwhile, if you look at what's happening around the world, you mentioned China, they're not the only one. We see other countries, moving to allocate parts of 6 gigahertz, which the U.S. has, taken a strong position for unlicensed on. I think, you look at it and you think, whoa, this is a pretty tall, order, a big mountain we need to climb.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It seems like a big mountain. I don't know, John Hunter, I don't know if you had any other perspective on this one.
So I would just add, I think if I were to prioritize the bands, obviously I'd start with, lower 3 gigahertz. I think as you start to look at the electromagnetic spectrum, you start to go north of that, you start to see a diminishing return in terms of propagation. So I think the utility of the band is very important from a mid-band point of view. So I would prioritize the lower 3 gigahertz. We're about to see what the PAS report is going to reveal, obviously how that would play into WRC negotiations, recognizing the fact that our friends at the Department of Defense are part of this deliberative process. I would also add that 4 gigahertz, which is not being studied, unfortunately. We have already a 3GP band associated with that, with band 79. So to the extent that we can focus on true mid-band, and really, and I probably would stop saying mid-band at the 7 gigahertz range. You start getting into 12 gigahertz, and it's more similar to millimeter wave. So I think we have to focus in on mid-band, and to Hank's point, you know, it's a pretty ominous picture when you look at where things are at today and how we're going to make this spectrum available going forward. And hopefully, 4 gigahertz will be at WRC 27.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we've hit a number of these bands while we've been talking the last few days here. I don't know if the vendors had maybe other bands that they wanted to cover on this one.
In terms of work 23 or work 27?
Yeah, work 23.
So in work 23, the agenda got set in work 19, those last 2 days. And so there's very specific bands in very specific regions. So like the ones that Hank was talking, some of those are restricted to other regions only. So there's what we can decide here at work 23, and then what we do at work 27. And I do agree, like we need to figure out how at work 23 and work 27, we are going to have sufficient spectrum available for study. And it's key to note it's for study, especially as we get into work 27 bands.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking of kind of the different regions, the way that things are broken up, Jose, maybe you can kind of talk to us about, you know, the rest of the world and how you see kind of how it's going for the other regions.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having me here. So just adding a little bit more context on the international work. So there are also some regional groups who try to send contributions to the WRC in order to compile different views in how to resolve the points in the WRC. So with that in mind, we have different regional groups. The ITU divided in 3, the world. We as America, we are part of Region 2, but there are also Region 1, Africa and Europe, and Region 3 from Asia mainly. So these different groups participate with contributions to the ITU. So we have seen quite different opportunities in mid-band spectrum. For instance, most of the world it's considering to identify the 6 gigahertz band for IMT, and for the Region 2, there are only 100 megahertz available for studying in this study cycle, but ASMG, for instance, and APT, which are from the Asia group, are willing to identify IMT, also with some conditions associated, but they want to. So this is something that it's of concern about the America's position because of the decisions we have seen in this frequency band. So there is also the statement of Commissioner Carr was pretty clear. So what do we are in Americas at this point in time? So we as Nokia see an opportunity to speed up the conversations. We believe that we have still time from WRC in order to try to be more positive in the way to identify IMT spectrum. And just to let you know, for instance, APT is looking for 3.3 till 1535. They are open to identify frequency bands within this frequency range. We have also ASMG, which are supporting 3.3 and also 3.6 to 3.8. This is the Arabic group. The ATU is also more or less the same. They are looking for 3.3 to 3.6. In Seattle, just to make it parentheses, we have this IIP, which is a regional position for WRC, supporting 3.3 to 3.4, but also 3.6 to 3.8. But what we are seeing for America's perspective, we saw in the past some commercial deployments in 3.5 frequency range, to say something. So we can say that for America, for USA, we just have one frequency band identified for possible identification for IMT, which is 3.3 to 3.4. So there is no any a good improvement, let's say, in IMT identification for this WRC. And finally, the CEPT has different views on the mid-band spectrum. They are just analyzing 6 gigahertz. some concerns about the protection of services, but they are more open to goes to the IMT identification in the whole 6 GHz band, which is from 690.25 till 7.125. No? So this is what the regional positions are going through the WRC.
Wow. Well, Luis, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of different priorities depending on where you're coming from in the world. I don't know if you want to outline any other.
José's response was very, very, very detailed. But what I'd like to add is that we looked into one study to understand the needs of mid-bands as GSMA. And from the study that we did with 36 different cities, I won't detail it necessarily, but 2 gigahertz of spectrum up to 2030 are necessary. And what is currently identified is just half of it in the mid-bands. And as we know, the mid-bands, as you started talking about, are prime, and 80% of 5G birth implementations were in 3.5 gigahertz. So that is very important. So as we look into kind of summarizing what we hear here, is that the United States have some limitations whenever it comes to the comparison to other countries. They are currently looking into expanding to get to those 2 gigahertz. We have here the not possibility to move forward with 4.8. 6 gigahertz has a decision that was taken. And there are limitations such as CBRS and some power limitations within the 3.5 gigahertz range that we just published a document that's with the CTIA earlier last month. So with all those limitations, the question is, where is the expansion going to happen? And how will the United States follow while other countries are expanding to get to those 2 gigahertz? How will the United States actually get to those 2 gigahertz without that expansion that each of them actually mentioned different parts of that conversation? So that's what I would like to add.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I mean, I know that my eyes will clearly be on Dubai as we kind of figure out, how we do expand. But John Kuzin, can you tell me why this is important? I mean, why are we up here? Why is this? Why do we care about international harmonization?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on the panel. So, international harmonization is obviously helpful for, economies of scale, making sure that your devices continue to work when you travel internationally, allows for, deployments to be more or less uniform, but it's not critical that the bands exactly line up, because a lot of the technologies that we're developing support a wider band, and you'll see that even when you look at millimeter wave bands or even the 3 gigahertz band where there's challenges, today's equipment is able to operate over a wide range. But just 2 things I wanted to say is, as has already been touched on, in the US, the CBRS rules actually are doing a disservice to having a commonality between the 3.4 band, the CBRS band, and the C band. And you'll see the challenges in that Ericsson and Samsung and others have filed waivers to address issues with the different out-of-band emission limits. And it creates real challenges in order to have uniform deployments, because the power levels, the in-band power levels are different, the out-of-band emissions are different. So like that is something that we should look to, having uniformity in actual technical operation. The other thing I wanted to say that we've been very focused on at Qualcomm in particular is, starting even 2 years ago, we began to advocate for spectrum for 6G. And due in large part to our advocacy, the chairwoman, FCC chairwoman, last March identified this 7 to 16 gigahertz range for 6G spectrum. So luckily, at the recent CTEL meeting up in Ottawa, we were able to secure an inter-American proposal for number of spectrum bands in this range without the US's help. Because I think the US is waiting on issuing their spectrum strategy, but there's some clear work that needs to be done in order to have a solid US position for 6G spectrum.
Thank you. Now, Jayne, I don't know if you'd had anything else to add on that.
I think the point John hit on in terms of what we call tuning ranges is really important, because it used to be with FDD spectrum, you really needed to have the exact same frequencies. And so if there's any engineers who accidentally stumbled into the policy track, thank you very much. It made our job a lot easier because it just needs to be sort of near. And that's part of why you see different regions looking at different spectrum bands under like Agenda Item 1.2. So thanks to any engineers, TDD really helps things for us.
No, yeah. I learned all about technology from engineers who were, helped me do it. But that was back in the WiMAX days, and but I would love to get a carrier perspective. So, John Hunter, why is when you're approaching spectrum acquisitions or getting spectrum, do you guys think about international harmonization, and why might it be important to you all?
It's very important. I think cost in general, certainly for the vendor community that have to, have a niche, supply chain as opposed to leveraging what you have globally, certainly creates a problem. But so critically important. I just want to address, this gloomy look as to where the spectrum is going to come from, right? I think, everybody recognizes we have a deficit in mid-band spectrum. And I think it's going to take a whole of government, to address this issue. And our friends at DOD, the State Department, and others, to really, come together and try to figure this out. I think we've got to get beyond admiring the problem and try to figure out what we're going to do to get more spectrum into the pipeline. And there's nothing there that's really going to satisfy the need that's pressing. And if we have to continue to wait to WRC 27 and beyond, where are we going to be from a 6G point of view? We may be on to 7G. So it's critically important we solve this as soon as possible.
Yeah, no, I obviously I agree with that. I mean, I think, you see the graphs, and as the data continues to grow up, that the demand for spectrum continues. And
right.
I know that Hank already mentioned, the mid-band deficit that we're facing. But I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on sort of the importance of harmonization to you all.
I think that John's really covered it. I mean, from the carrier perspective, I would emphasize, the speed and availability of equipment to get to deployment, to get to market, the roaming issues John referred to, and also it, helps minimize, border issues.
Yeah. No, those are all great points. I know that in my previous life, dealing with border issues was always a pleasure.
Constant pleasure.
But Jayne, can you talk about kind of the importance of U.S. leadership at these conferences, and maybe I know it sounds like there's maybe a bit of a dark cloud around this one at this point, but does it present opportunities as we get closer and closer to Dubai?
Yeah, actually, there's two main buckets I would put American leadership in terms of this, and I do think it's critically important, right? So the first one is the U.S. tends to be, in the past at least, a leader in terms of making the allocations first. And so you would see where, like the incentive auctions, for instance, there wasn't anything in the radio regs that would have permitted it. So November of 2015, I was locked in a room basically with another administration working on the technical rules because we were going to do the incentive auctions in the following like Q1 of the next year, right? So if we did not get that mobile allocation, then even though we had everything set up domestically, we would not have been able to do it on a primary basis, which is absolutely critical. So it's a piece that enables the U.S. to take forward-leaning positions. The other way is we're actually able to really shape a lot of the international community because there is a desire to make sure that we're within tuning ranges or that which bands you're sort of focused on. And so like at Work 19, the millimeter wave bands, if you look at the decisions, those were basically highly correlated with what the US had done domestically. So we were able to drive a lot of the same situation around the world by moving first. It's really important for the US to have that leadership position if we really want to drive a lot of these discussions. And to have that leadership position, you actually have to be there, you have to have things on the table that you're able to start those discussions and really be an active participant driving.
Yep. John, you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Jayne was saying. So the FCC in July of 2016 opened up the millimeter wave bands, right? And that drove, like Jayne just said, the decision in 19 to move this to the international stage. We're nowhere near that now, and that is very concerning when we're looking at even 5G Advanced, 6G. It's a little sketchy, dicey. I mean, pick your adjective. It's unsettling.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Luiz, I don't know, kind of in your perspective at GSMA, do you see trends? I know that I think several of you all have laid out a number of bands that are being discussed, but are there trends that you're seeing in terms of harmonization? I don't know if you could speak to that.
Of course. I think the first comment is that harmonization, as everybody said, makes a huge difference for economies of scale and possibilities of roaming, etc. And it does make a huge difference for smaller nations that do not have the leadership of actually making possibilities of having access to specific bands or taking decisions before others or before decisions they are taken within the ITU level. So internationally, harmonization is even more important whenever it comes to nations that do not have such a huge market that would then create economies of scale by themselves. So it is different, and it makes a huge difference. That's why we have 5.2 billion people connected currently. So I think that's another message. But whenever it comes to the trends that we're seeing, the next trend is the harmonization within the 6 gigahertz band. And that is something that we've studied a little bit of the ecosystem and the preparation for the ecosystem to come soon. And 95% of our operators said they are interested and would move forward with 6 gigahertz if the band is available. So the triggers that the stakeholders said that would be necessary would be interest from operators, so demand, plus the CC23 decisions. And what we are seeing now is that ATU, CPT, ASMG, and lots of countries within the APG set of countries are interested in moving forward with the full upper part of the band. There's 6425 to 7125. So that's something that we'll see. And that opportunity of harmonization and looking into what comes next for this year is what we see as the trend of the first movement of new harmonization, other than, because when we talk about 3.5, it's a band that is already in use in different ranges, and starting from 3.3 going up to 4.1 in lots of countries. So it's already within the process. So I would say that the trend currently is on the 6 gigahertz discussion that will.
Okay. Yeah, Jayne.
Yeah, if I could just clarify though, recognizing the sensitivities around 6 gigahertz, I just want to note that like region 1, so the CPT, ATU, and ASMG regions, that is where it is in scope for Work 23. And those are the countries that are making some of those decisions. In region 2, in the Americas region, the decision was for no change. And then in region 3, there was not a decision. There were some countries that are looking at it. So I just want to clarify what the situation is.
No, thank you. And my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert on kind of the process, but it does sound like this is a very process-driven, outcomes.
The UN and process? No.
Would never. Yeah.
But and I think we've alluded to it. I think John Kuzin just mentioned it. But Jose, I mean, how do you think kind of the regional process, like the regional preparations, are going for Work 23?
Yeah, well, it depends on the region you are talking about, because as well as for the WRC. For this WRC and seeing also for WRC 27, there are different views on depends on the regional group. But for the 1.2, which is the agenda item, which is going to be for IMT in this conference, we are seeing pretty much, let's say, consensus in the mid-band spectrum, which is 3.3, and also 3.6, 3.8. It is just for Americas, but there is a quite standard frequency band. 10.5, we don't have a regional position. I mean, from Americas, some countries wanted to identify 10.5 for IMT, but some others won't, and this is the case of USA and Canada, for just to say some countries supporting no change in this frequency band. But for 10.5 seems to be a frequency band that will be identified just for countries through a footnote in the radio regs, so it is not having so much hype, the 10.5. So those are the frequency bands. The 6 gigahertz band, as Jayne said, for region 2 is not being considered, just the 100 upper part of this frequency band, but taking into consideration the other regions seems to that we will have an IMT identification. We don't know yet if it's going to be a regional identification or perhaps a footnote with some countries adding their name to have this IMT. But the issue here is, I believe, the word we have heard in this panel, which is leadership. When you don't have, as a country, a leadership position on IMT spectrum, which in any frequency band, you will face later on some issues in terms of a public policy. Because the way it works in WRC is to create an environment to have different alternatives for governments, to have different, again, alternatives to do this spectrum policy. And when you take a look or ask to a vendor like Nokia, which are the frequency bands supported more beyond that 3GPP or RATU, you will face that perhaps some vendors won't have equipment for the frequency band you are looking for. And if the vendor are willing to promote or to create equipment in that frequency band, then we arrive to the economies of scale. And this has an impact directly to the citizens, because you will have the equipment, but the equipment will be more expensive. So that's the reason we need to talk about spectrum harmonizations in advance. So this is the reason this ITU regulatory process takes a lot of time. So 4 years to decide who are you going to talk about in the next WRC, and then you have to work through the ITU, but also in the 3GPP to have the standards and to have the equipment ready for the next generation. So that's the case of 6G, and we are going to talk about a little bit about this in the coming.
Yeah, I know that everyone's itching to get to 6G, but we'll get there.
We all do.
John.
Yeah, I just want to unpack a little bit there. Let's think about every band that was just mentioned there. 3, 4, 7, 10. What's the common denominator? Department of Defense. So I think we have to figure out, in your point about leadership, I think what we have to do is we go to, the WRC, sessions, we have to start finding that leadership as a U.S. position. And certainly, I'm not counter to DoD. I'm very supportive of DoD, but I think we have to find a way to advance the nation's economy, our 5G, 6G economy, and finding the spectrum, while at the same time protecting national defense and critical military systems. And there has to be a way forward. If there isn't a way forward, what are we going to do when 6G comes around? I mean, there's nothing. We have 100 megahertz that's going to be discussed at this next WRC. Where's it coming from? So leadership is critical here, and hopefully with the delegation coming together that, the State Department, our friends at the Defense Department can come together on some common cause.
Yeah. And now, Hank and John, Kuzin, I'm hoping to kind of hear how you think, industry perspectives are being included in sort of the preparation for Work 23. Have you seen, good collaboration, or how do you think it's going from the industry perspective?
So I guess I would say maybe the industry gets an A for effort at this point. I think that there's been a pretty persuasive showing by industry of the need for allocations for IMT, but I can't say we've broken through on with the U.S. I mean, our whole discussion, John's points he just made, I think we've faced obviously strong opposition, DoD, federal agencies, but also from unlicensed interests, satellite interests. It's been a tough road so far. Jayne, I hope she's got the view that, we're going to come through, we're going to get it at the end. Maybe John's right, the delegations come together. The other thing I would, if I was to say, well, here's maybe we'll get some hope from would be, maybe the national spectrum strategy will, identify a path toward leadership for the U.S. So, at this stage, I would say A for effort, but not for results.
John Kuzin, you're nodding your head. You agree?
I would agree with everything. Hank hit everything that I was thinking of saying. So let's go on to the next question.
Well, I don't know, Jayne. You made a promise.
Sorry. The one thing I would say, just to make it very clear, is all of us have met with everybody in the U.S. government that matters, and it's basically still a black box, which is unsettling, and that's kind of the state of affairs. Like all of us have not stopped to advocate for the needs for 5G Advanced, for 6G, et cetera. So I am hopeful that we will come through, but it is, not the place where I wish we were.
Okay, well, I will give up. I will stop looking for optimism. No, I'm just kidding. I think that's right. I think there's an opportunity there, and I know that it has been maybe a little bit frustrating to not have a better grasp of what's happening. But yeah, I think there's optimism that Jayne will pull it out at the end, as Hank so helpfully promised.
It's all on you, Jayne. It's all on you.
If I could
Please.
So I will say I'm very concerned, and with the potential for a government shutdown, I'm even more concerned. This is not the first time that we've had, sort of how do we put forward an agenda item to study, and I want to emphasize to study more bans. And in the past, the U.S. has gotten to a position where they balanced national security, like military concerns or federal agency concerns, with economic security. And they've looked at what we can bring to the table, our industry can bring to the table for Americans, for the U.S. economy overall, and said, okay, how do we do this? I am concerned when I look at the calendar, where we are with a shutdown looming and where the conference is, because you actually have to have those discussions, and it's not getting easier. The low-hanging fruit is gone, medium-hanging fruit is gone, the high-hanging fruit is gone. It's hard, right? So we have to figure out a way for the U.S. to be able to say, we are here, we are ready, we know what we're going to do, and we're going to be able to do that at the conference. And I am concerned, given what the calendar says and the possibility of a shutdown.
Yeah, no, the point on the shutdown is a good one. And I think, it's been mentioned several times on several different panels. So it seems to be another dark cloud maybe that we're looking at. You guys have twisted my arm enough, so maybe we could turn looking to the future a bit. And I think, Jayne, you had mentioned how the agendas are set for the next WRC at the one. So at this one, they'll start talking WRC 27. I guess it's a similar question I asked before, but why is it so important to be ready for WRC 27 now? Like what about the harmonization now, or the work now, that's going to go into WRC 27? Why is that important?
So if you took, I think Jose had gone through the list of different bans that are being studied considered in different regions. And the commonality is other regions are also struggling to figure out which bans are going to be okay. Which bans, there are obviously a lot of different applications in mid-band. And so which ones are possible to study? And even if we got to agreement within the United States today, and today we had a magic piece of paper that said, here's the US position, we're all aligned, we're ready to go. There's 170 plus countries that will be there. And there's going to be a lot of discussion to get there. And you can't go into a 4-week conference where you've got 17, 18 agenda items, plus all the different ones that are being considered, and hope for the best. You have to have a position. You have to be talking to those other countries. Right now, there's actually an interregional going on in Geneva. Those discussions are happening. If you don't have a position, you're kind of sitting, waiting, and hearing what everybody else is saying. We need to be convincing them now.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. John Kuzin, Jayne just mentioned a magical piece of paper. There is a national spectrum strategy that will be coming out in the future. How do you think that plays into kind of the preparation for WRC 27?
Yeah, I think like has already been said or mentioned by Hank, from what we're hearing, that the national spectrum strategy is going to drive their position at WRC. And again, we all have our fingers crossed what's going to be in there, et cetera, and is it going to be too late? We need to be preparing and planning and strategizing now. So we'll have to see what's in it. It's better that there's a strategy than not, but again, the time is short.
Yeah, as always, right? The devil's in the details. Luiz, what are you seeing? Kind of from a maybe a broader perspective in terms of getting ready for 6G and WRC 27.
No, of course, when talking about different regions of the world, when we look into the CTEL Ottawa that just finished this month and started last month result, we are incredibly happy to see 11 countries going forward with an interregional American proposal for looking into the lower part of 3 gigahertz, as well as something around 7 to 8.5 and closer to 15 gigahertz. So from the GSMA perspective, what we believe is necessary to be studied, as mentioned, is at least from 7 to 15. And what happens is, for example, ASMG, the Arab group, is looking into 7 to 15 as their proposal, as well as up to 4.2 for the next WRC. We are looking into the APT discussions are starting 4.4 and going up to 15.35. So that's also something for us to bear in mind, that they haven't decided which parts of the band will be their proposal, but the proposal is to go forward for that. So there is an international interest and understanding of the needs for more spectrum, especially for the development of mobile technology towards 6G. And understanding that 6G will be a reality. We just had the finalization of the IMT 2030 in June by the ITU, so that means we already know what is expected, what are the additional capabilities of 6G, and spectrum comes with it. Of course, there are ways of using spectrum that can be better used. As we know, we've been doing that, but we cannot ignore the additional spectrum for 6G is important. And having that said, we know that in CTEL, that proposal comes with 11 countries, and it does not include the United States. So I think that was mentioned by everybody, that it's important for us to bear in mind what happens next.
Yeah, thank you. And Jose, I don't know if your perspective is different as a vendor. Are you seeing the same things as Luis?
No, it's not different. We agree with the statements, but perhaps just to add to this conversation in terms of the future, we at Nokia, we are working nowadays in the development of 6G. So this is important for us because we need to settle the investment for technology perspective. So 6G is based on the frequency band that we are going to study. It's not the same to do a study for 6 gigahertz band rather than to do it for 14 gigahertz frequency band. So for us, it is important to have a guideline for governments in order to start putting this money in R&D in order to have the 6G technology ready for the future. So for us, it is important, the WRC 27 process. So what we have seen based on the studies we have made through the GSA, it is that we will need from 500 to 750 megahertz band of additional spectrum for each network. So we have seen 1500 megahertz band from the additional spectrum from here to 10 years. But if we consider this study from GSA, we are talking about a little bit more amount of spectrum needed. So this is important in terms of the technology evolution. So the leadership, again, it is important. Just Luis said, USA is not supporting the new frequency band. What we have seen from Nokia perspective is that we took, well, the government took binary decisions. It is this one or this one. But when you are talking about the future and you take a look on the national table of allocation, you will see that almost all the spectrum is assigned. So you will see mobile allocations in some frequency bands, but the point is you won't have dedicated spectrum at all for 6G. So our point now, and the key word for Nokia is coexistence and compatibility. So from here, from WRC 23 through WRC 27, it is an important period in order to do the technical studies. So we need the support as much as all the countries can have a position in this WRC 27. So we would love to see the US government more engaged in this 6G spectrum availability. So we hope that with this national strategy that we believe is going to be ready for the end of this year, we are going to have more view, but perhaps this is the time in order to do it because WRC, as Jens said, it is just approaching and we don't have enough time to make this kind of decisions globally.
Can I add just one piece on that? The US timetable never lines up with the work timetable, but we don't get the option to change the work timetable, right? So if we don't intercept at the right points, like in November, December, they will decide what will be studied for 4 more years, for the next 4 years. So if we're like, your next bite at the apple basically would then be work 31, right? So it's really important that we're ready, we're participating, we're influencing, and we're getting to successful decisions. Because the US timetable, we can't ask the other countries to change the schedule.
Yeah, no, that's a great point about the schedules not aligning. Hank, when you look into your magical crystal ball and you look at WRC 27, do you see the same kind of spectrum pipeline opportunities? Is that what you guys are focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has made the point that as, you know, a year from now, hopefully that's what we're talking about, is we're getting ready for work 27. We're looking at the feasibility of bands, the bands that people have been mentioning. I mean, there's no, as far as I know, there's no hidden source of spectrum that we haven't been able to find. So yeah, I think that's what we got to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We have about a minute or so left, so maybe one last kind of lightning round for you all. I just want to know kind of what you think maybe the top decision coming out of WRC might be. We'll just go maybe down the line, starting with you, Luis, and we'll work this way.
Of course. I think 2 different things. 6G spectrum, so WRC 27 agenda item, coming from agenda item 10 from 23. I think that this will be something we'll be talking a lot about in a year from now. And the second one is 6 gigahertz. Why? Because the first implementations will be happening. As I mentioned, the study that we did 12 months after WRC, that's a trigger for the first commercial implementations of 6 gigahertz to happen. So I think those 2 things would be the biggest ones that we'll be hearing about in the next course of 12 months. But I would say as the last one that we are very excited to see what happens and what the decisions of Agenda Item 10 brings to the discussions for the next 4 years of studies to see what 6G spectrum will bring. So I think it's incredibly important. I hope to see everybody in Dubai as well.
John Kuzin?
I would say 6G spectrum. As much of studies of the bands between 7 and 16, we're only asking to study, not allocate, which is crazy that we can't even get to that step.
Hank?
So I think obviously the identification of bands for future study for work 27, I think from my perspective, that's the number one thing that's going to come out of it with, hopefully a good result.
Jayne?
Well, I wanted Hank's map to the extra spectrum. So if we can't have that, then the 6G bands for study.
We all want that map. John Hunter?
And I think everything that's been said, I agree with. I just make a point and make a comment. I just hope restoring auction authority doesn't go at the pace of WRC.
And Jose?
So I agree the new evolution for 6G spectrum is going to be the topic, but from our perspective, it is because we want to do studies in order to see which frequency bands could be appropriate to work together with the incumbent services. So this is actually the point. Not allocated at this point in time, but let's do the studies in order to realize which are most appropriate frequencies for IMG.
Great. Thank you so much, and this was a great discussion, and thank you for attending.